Hello, hello. All right, thanks everyone for joining us. I see some people are still, trickling in. So we will get started in just a second while everyone just joins us. So while we are, just getting started, I will start just with some general notes. The first of which is that just for registering for today, but especially for attending, you will be getting a follow-up email that does have some information, including just any perhaps resources that we feel would be helpful based on the content of today. But at the very least, you will be getting a pre-recorded version of this content in addition to the slides for today. So you will be getting the slides, so feel free to either take your own notes or take notes alongside or just wait for those slides. So with that, we can jump in and get started. So hello and welcome. We are going to be going through our grad school webinar today, really just answering the question of, now, later, maybe never. Because grad school is a big decision. So thanks for joining. My name is Megan Wood. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the career coaches on our team today. So I am actually, though, going to, blank out for our content today, just to make sure that we can really focus in on what it is that we are focusing in on today. Before we jump into the content itself, though, we always like to start our workshops with a land acknowledgement. And stating that the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And we have this map over on the side too. So perhaps if you are not from either of the three spaces that our campuses are on, or perhaps if you're not on campus at the moment now, I recommend taking a look and seeing perhaps what areas within the map are perhaps where you are from, or if you're not from any of the regions that are listed here, looking up for yourself as well, like where the land that either you're currently sitting on or the land that you are from is a part of. So thanks for taking this moment with me to have this acknowledgement. And moving into some of the kind of agenda pieces, just a brief overview just to get started of what we're going to be focusing on today. So firstly, we're going to, dive into the different types of graduate programs. We're going to talk about how to clarify your objectives, doing the math, because it can be costly to go to graduate school, as well as identifying next steps, and then ultimately making that decision. Keeping in mind that we are very likely not going to come to a full decision by the end of today, but hopefully some of this content can really help you in getting closer to making that decision if you're still kind of iffy about it. So firstly, there are these different types of graduate programs and degrees. There are doctoral degrees, and there are also master's degrees. And there are a number of different types of degrees within each of these types. So for doctoral degrees, there are PhDs. These are going to be research focusing on teaching, perhaps at the university level. A PhD usually takes between 5 and 6+ years. Some students will end up taking much longer than that, but the average is about 5 to 6. And you oftentimes teach through and work throughout your program. There are also healthcare doctoral degrees, such as getting an MD or a DO. Those are working in 2 different types of medicine, a DDS, becoming a doctor, a dentist, a DPT, doctor of physical therapy, or a PharmD, going into pharmacy. There are also industry-specific doctoral programs, such as getting a doctor of education or a doctor of psychology, an EdD or PsyD. And each of these are, of course, going to be really particular to a specific field. And that's true not just of doctoral degrees, but also of master's degrees. So there are 2 primary types of master's degrees. The first being research, where you are getting an MA, which is a Master of Arts, or that MS, which is a Master of Science. And your primary focus will be a little bit more on research, perhaps writing like a thesis paper during your program. And there are also professional master's degrees, and these will range through a number of different types of fields that are going to be a little more specific, and there may or may not be a large kind of thesis element. So a professional might include a Master of Education, Public Policy, Public Health, Social Work, Business Administration, or Finance. And this is not by any means a complete list, because a number of programs may be either coming to become new, or there may just be individual or different names for some of these at different schools. But there is a big difference too between the idea of a terminal versus a continuous master's degree. A terminal master's degree is going to be, I would say, one of the more common types. That's where you are just entering into a master's degree program, and you will simply complete that program with just that master's degree. There are also some programs that will be continuous, where after earning your master's degree, you will get the opportunity to continue and earn that doctoral degree, like that PhD, for example. So some of these more continuous programs can be helpful if you're still trying to figure out if maybe you want a PhD, and you can consider looking for a program that will give you the option of kind of terminating to earn that master's degree along the way if you realize that maybe it's not for you, or vice versa. If you earn that master's degree and you're just super excited to keep going, you can sometimes go on and continue to earn the doctoral degree. So it's super simple going through those two types of graduate programs, doctoral and master's. And it can also be really helpful then to clarify your objectives as a next step. So firstly, just figuring out, okay, well, what even is an objective? So just the most basic definition, it could be something that your efforts or actions are intended to attain or accomplish. So ultimately, it can be your purpose for going to graduate school, your goal from going to graduate school, or a target by going. So it's just something that you are trying to achieve. What is your objective? And there are a number of different types of objectives that we can oftentimes recommend, or that oftentimes students will start to think about when going into grad school. So the first of these is starting a career. So one reason is that if you are positive that the professional role that you are seeking can't be achieved without going through that further education, that is a wonderful reason for wanting to go into graduate school. And that's a wonderful objective to keep in mind. Some examples of that might be a lawyer, a counselor, a teacher, things that you might need that master's or professional degree to ultimately do that job. You just can't do it without the degree. Perhaps you're also maybe already working, but it's difficult or maybe impossible to advance in your career without going back to school and getting that degree and furthering your education. Some examples of that are oftentimes in business or public administration or public health, where that credential and getting to really spend extra time at a graduate level with that particular content can be really beneficial. And oftentimes some of these programs might even look specifically for people who are going back to school who already have some job experience. And some programs, particularly with MBAs, Master of Business Administration degrees, they might even require it for some particular programs. So that's another really good objective to keep in mind. Maybe after you start working, you can go back to school, or maybe you already are. A third objective to consider is maybe if you want to create a body of work that will allow you to advance in your career, specifically in terms of like craftsmanship. So things like getting a Master of Fine Arts, that is one of the particular degrees that is going to be really specific to a more creative field, like getting into whether that be theater or design or writing, like creative writing, and really to just focus in on the craftsmanship of something. So we've gone through the different types of programs, talked about different opportunities of objectives. The next thing that we're going to spend a couple of slides on is the math. And keeping in mind too that some of the things that maybe you're starting to think through yourself in terms of objectives, maybe weren't listed. We only focused on the three top primary reasons that students tend to go back and earn that doctoral or master's degree, but we're going to talk about some other ideas a little bit later as well. But we're going to spend the next couple of slides looking at numbers. And I recognize that numbers can be kind of confusing. I myself got my undergraduate degree in English and my graduate degree in education. Math is not my strongest suit. But if there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand and I will do my best to clarify on any of the things that we're looking at. So the first slide that we're going to be kind of looking at is the average debt by graduate degree type. from medical professionals to law to MBA holders, a master's of science or engineering, other master's degrees, which might include like the Master of Education or Public Policy or Social Work, for examples. And lastly, that Master of Arts. So the average debt we might see for like medical professionals and lawyers are the highest. They are almost at like $200,000 and almost at $150,000 for those top two. The remaining four are under 100, even under 75,000 for those bottom three. But it is helpful to just go into one of these or into your application process with the idea that this will very likely cost money. Also keeping in mind that there are so many different aspects of where that debt will come from, or how you can minimize debt while you are in school, whether that be through working, through getting an assistantship while you are enrolled in your program, or finding funding in some other way. But this is something that's just generally really helpful to kind of think about. So the average debt by these different degree types are listed here. And now we're going to spend some time answering that question of, okay, well, which graduate degree comes with the most debt relative to the income? So firstly, I'm just going to focus on what the debt to income is going to look like. So for each of these 6 different types of degrees, we have the average debt listed here. The 191 for our medical professionals, the 62 for our Masters of Arts, and so on. This is how much money you are going to owe on average. Again, this number might be lower, it might be higher. This is just an average that you're going to owe. This is also on this column, the average income that you are going to have. How much money are you going to have coming in versus the amount of money that you're supposed to have going out? So your income, ideally, you want this number on the right here to be higher than the number on the left, because we want to have more income than we have debt, hopefully. But keeping in mind too, that you're not going to have to pay back all of your debt all at once. You will have time to do that. So this third column here, this average DTI, this average debt to income, ultimately what this is helping us kind of look at is how much money am I going to owe per dollar that I'm going to kind of get. So based on this, for every dollar that someone has in debt, for every $1.41 of debt that this person has, they will make $1. For Master of Arts, there will be $1.07 of debt for every dollar that this person has. Law, pretty even. You're going to be owing someone $1 for every dollar that you make. And then once we get into these bottom three, it becomes a little bit less. So for every dollar that you make, or for every dollar that you make, you only have 86 cents that you owe. For every dollar you make, 81 cents you owe. For 71 cents that you owe. So this can, again, be a little tricky to just kind of think through, especially when we're just looking at all of these numbers at once. But it's not necessarily that we do want to see that number as low as possible, but also considering how much you're going to be making over time and how much that increase in income is really going to help you with paying that debt down sooner. Because we might notice that medical professionals, they had the highest number up there. They were almost at $200,000, but odds are their cost of living is going to allow them, as someone who has a higher earning, to pay down their debt way more quickly, like it says here. So this is what we're ultimately trying to do, is after we are in our careers, we want to make sure that that is going to pay off for us in terms of how much we're going to be able to pay down that debt. And basically looking at those numbers, it oftentimes kind of looks like most, if not all of these, will pay off. But also seeing too that like a Master of Arts is going to pay off potentially really well, because for every dollar that this person is going to I mean, firstly, for lawyers is still pretty similar, still about a 1-to-1. But for every $1.12 of debt, we might only make that dollar for some of these, versus for MBA. For every dollar that someone is making, they're still only going to owe that 71 cents. So going through and asking yourself, is this something that is going to ultimately help me not just in terms of reaching my career, but also again, with the math component, the component of how much is this going to cost? And again, that's a lot of numbers, a lot of things to kind of look at. And this is going to change for every single person because again, your debt might be different than the averages listed here, or your income might be different for the averages listed here. Especially if you maybe have a higher paying job or live in a more in a place like Seattle, for example, where yes, the cost of living might be higher, but also you might have a chance to make a higher income. So these are just some of the things to keep in mind when you're considering, is this going to be a financially sound decision for myself? So again, we talked a lot about numbers. Again, feel free to put any of your questions into our Q&A, whether it be about that last kind of idea or any of the prior ones. But we're going to spend a little bit of time now identifying some of our next potential steps. So here, the next couple of slides are going to focus on some different ways for us to do career research. So WOIS, or VOICE, is the Career Information System for Washington State. This is one of the options, and what they really have on here is a lot of really cool information through the state of Washington about different career outcomes, different career planning resources, as well as different ways to just learn a little bit more about perhaps some of the financial implications of this degree. Perhaps if we are looking more so even just generally at the career that we have an interest in, if we want to go into say like data analysis and we're looking at the data analysis page in this platform, is it telling us that getting that graduate degree is going to be a requirement now? Perhaps it'll be a requirement or something that we might be interested in doing later so we can advance in our career. Or maybe it helps us realize that, oh, people don't usually need that data. They don't usually need that graduate degree to be a data analyst. Maybe I don't need to do this, or maybe it won't fit with what I ultimately want to do as a future career long term. So another resource that we can that we like to highlight as well is ONET Online. This one here is another really cool resource that will allow you to look at a lot of those same things. There's actually a lot of different sections in ONET Online. And one thing that I'll mention as well, again, for maybe anyone who joined a little late, you will be getting a copy of these slides and a copy of these links essentially, so that you don't have to just remember what they were called. I'll be sending a follow-up for us as well. But with each of these different sections, we can learn, again, a little bit more about each career, about what might be required to do this particular, go into this particular career path. What are the experience requirements or the, educational requirements? What are the things that I might want to kind of work on now, or what is the requirement that I want in order to, or the requirement that I need in order to really succeed in this field. So a similar position, or sorry, a similar website that can show you more about different positions is My Next Move. It is very, very similar to ONET Online. They're actually sister sites. So they have a lot of the same information, just shared in different visual formats. This one is a little more easy to just kind of see at a glance, whereas the last page that we looked at for ONET, each of those different web pages might be a little more full of information. But we can see that, like, for one, there's an education tab at the bottom. It'll help show us like, oh, bachelor's degree or master's degree. Maybe if I want to be a social science research assistant, it might be a good idea to go and get that master's degree. Or maybe if we're looking at things like, oh, well, the job outlook, or what the expected salaries might be, or similarly, just what some of the general skills and abilities might be. But this can be a cool way, again, to do that career research for us to better see, is this a fit for us? And is this something we want to do? Lastly, one of the things to consider is looking at UW alumni, people who have graduated from the university, or perhaps if you're not interested in going to UW for graduate school, same thing, perhaps looking at a different university's webpage on LinkedIn, because you always have access to look at the alumni who have graduated. One other thing to consider is not just the alumni who graduated with the graduate degree of interest, but maybe just your undergraduate degree. You can see, okay, well, what are the people doing who don't go to graduate school? Are they still doing, some of the things that I'm interested in? And being able to look at the alumni tool, and LinkedIn does have a updated interface right now. So the alumni tab won't be on the left, but rather in a long bar link on the just underneath their name, but still super easy. Whoop, scrolling a little fast there. Still pretty easy to see. But this is a way to kind of look at, okay, well, what are people who work at Microsoft in this greater Seattle area? There's also a filter for different degree types so that you can also see, okay, what are they doing or what are they, up to now? And I see we have a question in our Q&A. I will get to those in the last couple of minutes because we'll definitely have some time after the next like 2 or 3 slides. So some of the questions to really ask yourself about these different, possible careers, or even about these particular alumni search tools, like we just saw in the last slide. Some of these potential questions might be, okay, well, what are the top employers among alumni in this program? Who is hiring people with this degree or from this university? Another thing to consider might be, well, how long does it take on average for students to graduate? You can oftentimes find that information on a program webpage. They like to usually mention how long students will take when they're going either part-time or full-time, depending on the type of degree. Also considering, okay, well, do most students work maybe full-time or part-time during the program? Because perhaps if you're going back to school, you maybe want to see if there's still a way to support yourself still by, continuing to work. Or if maybe you want to just get maybe a part-time job while you're going to school part-time or full-time or opposite, vice versa. There's a number of things that you might want to just think about when it's getting ready to figure out what is my life going to look like when I'm in this program. So the last thing to consider is when you are making the decision. Just because you've applied to a program does not mean that you are committed to attending that program. Applying is different than accepting. So you are allowed to turn down an offer of admission, even if they have looked at your application, you've applied, you put all this effort into it. It is okay to say no. Especially if you get admitted to multiple programs. You can only pick one to go to. So you will eventually have to turn down some of those roles or some of those admittances if you are admitted into multiple programs anyways. But even if all you do is apply to one or are accepted to one, you still don't have to say yes. Another thing to consider is that some programs or universities will offer the opportunity to defer your admission. And that means saying yes, that you will attend, but in a year or 2 years, that you will just attend later. And every program at every university is going to have a different kind of guideline on whether or not they accept deferrals, but it still never hurts to ask if that's something that you feel would really fit your just current situation a little bit better. So some of the things that also go into making that decision are perhaps seeing if when you apply to graduate programs, maybe you're also applying to jobs at the same time and see what you are offered, or if you really do need that graduate degree, or if maybe you want to just see what happens first because you're equally interested in both perhaps. Because something to consider is that you don't really have options until you have offers. So if you are applying to a number of graduate programs or a number of jobs, and you aren't really getting through to like the acceptance the offer kind of stage of either, you can really help hone down and figure out what your options are because you haven't really gotten the offers yet to say yes or no to. So similarly to like what we were mentioning earlier, trying to compare the cost of the program with the average salary for the job that you'll be seeking after you graduate. If the program is going to cost you like $100,000, and you know that after graduating, you maybe will only be making maybe $60,000, for example, is that gap of having to come up with that $40,000 extra, over the course of your time, just based on the, difference in the ratio of your salary to your debt. Is that going to, again, be worth it? Are you going to be in debt for 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, trying to figure out what it is worth it for you? Also considering, though, that you might still be entry level after finishing a graduate program, and asking yourself, well, if I'm entry level now and I'll be entry level still after my graduate program, do I want to go right into my grad degree now? Or maybe do I want to go back to school after getting some experience first? Because a lot of positions might really prioritize some of that experience versus just education. So one of the last things to consider for this is the reasons to attend versus reasons perhaps not to attend. So some of the things that we mentioned earlier as those 3 big objectives were the fact that you're certain that long-term professional goals that you have can't be achieved without that further education. So again, some examples of that might be like going into psychology or counseling, perhaps teaching or healthcare, because those are fields that require that extra school. They require that additional degree in order to do that thing. You need specialized either certification or education. Also, perhaps if you're interested in a career in academia or research, because those will oftentimes always require a PhD, a doctoral level degree. Not always, but most of them will at the very least require the master's level. But going into research, usually a PhD is the way to go. But what that means then is that there are oftentimes reasons not to attend. Some of which being that maybe you're trying to just avoid applying for jobs. You just don't know what the job market's going to look like. You're afraid of, a recession perhaps. You want to avoid it altogether. But just because you don't know what you're going to do after graduating now, going to graduate school doesn't mean that you're suddenly going to know what to do after graduating just because you have another degree or more time to figure it out. Also, just because you maybe don't know what you want to do professionally, graduate school is not the place to figure that out most often, because at graduate school, you are applying to a program where all you're going to be doing is focusing on the content of the program you applied to. So if you're still on the fence about the type of work you want to do, a graduate degree is not going to help you explore different options very easily. Because attending grad school might not really help you with either of these things. You're just delaying the time when maybe you'll have to make that decision. So I see that we do have some questions, one of which is in the chat and the other of which is in our Q&A. It looks like my chat is not allowing me to kind of pull it up. So if you had a question in the chat, can you go ahead and put that into the Q&A again for me so that I can see that, please? That would be awesome. So are there tuition numbers for graduate schools at UW? So the tuition is going to really just depend on, for one, the number of credits that your program requires. So if I'm actually going to stop my share, and since we're done with the content, I will come back. Hello. It looks like, well, since I have stopped sharing my screen, I can't actually see the chat now. So I can go ahead and answer that in just a minute as well as we, finish up. I'm just pulling up really quickly a link to the UW grad school tuition page. So a lot of programs will have different costs, especially depending on if it's going to be a fee-based program versus a different type of program, where maybe it is just based on just general tuition costs. I'm trying to find the page specifically for what the tuition costs are. It looks like a lot of them are actually per chance even specific to the program itself. Here we go. I have found it. Awesome. So I'm gonna just put this into our chat. So to answer that question then about the tuition, this is UW's tuition information. If there are more specific questions about tuition, I definitely recommend reaching out to the contacts on this page, because beyond what is listed on this page, I have no idea. I do not work in that office, but I would be happy to point you in a direction if you're still struggling. And it looks like we have one last question. So from Nadir, so would PhDs requiring students to do a TA or RA-ship with the program also come with debt? Yeah, so that's again, I very, very briefly mentioned that because the majority of that debt or those, debt to income kind of ratios were focused on master's degrees. A lot of PhD programs do come with specific funding, oftentimes in the form of an assistantship. So assistantships very, very often, almost always do come with a tuition stipend or a tuition waiver, perhaps even in addition to a actual stipend. So some come with both, many come with both because you're doing work. So that is where a PhD can be helpful, in that oftentimes PhDs end up trying to help you get as much funding as you can. So very good question. And yes, and I see that we're just a minute over our time. So I do still have a minute, it looks like, if there are any final questions, but if not, then I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for joining.